And today we're going to be talking about shells and the people who love them. And on that note, I'm going to share my screen again. Get us thinking about shells. I'm betting that you are one of those people who loves shells, and that's one of the reasons why you're here with us today. So I would like for you to take a moment and reflect on what you love about shells, and feel free to share those thoughts with others in the chat. What do you love about shells? What are you curious about? How are some ways that shells have played a role in your life? There's a long history of people being captivated by shells, whether for their diversity, their beauty, their accessibility, for those of us who live near the ocean. And I think probably most of us here today have a memory, whether recent or in the distant past, of bending down and picking up a shell and marveling at it. But when we do that, we might not be thinking about the organism that it belongs to, which is another thing that I find fascinating about shells and that often surprises me. So these two organisms that we're looking at, abalone and olive snails, or olivella, are two local organisms that have long histories here in Santa Cruz. And like I said, today we're going to be talking about shells, but also the people who live them. And people have interacted with these organisms for thousands of years here along the Central Coast. And so I want to take a moment to acknowledge that. That the land that the museum is located on, and the land that I'm speaking to you from today, is the unceded territory of the Awaswa-speaking Yuipi tribe. The Amamutsin tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people taken to missions Santa Cruz and San Juan Bautista during Spanish colonization of the Central Coast, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historic trauma. And the Amamutsin tribal band continues to engage with these organisms and to practice cultural traditions, including using shells to make beads and pendants, which we're going to be talking about a little bit later. And these two organisms that we see here on the screen, the abalone and the olive snail, are two of those really important organisms. So we're going to be getting into that in a little bit. And we're also going to be telling this history, but also other historic lenses for how people have interacted with shells. And on that note, I'm going to be inviting Kathleen, our collections manager, to pop in so that we can start talking about those varying histories of shell collections and of our shell collection today with us. So hello, Kathleen. Want to unmute yourself?
I do want to unmute myself. Hello, Marissa, and hi, folks. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. It's been really fun watching all the comments from people talking about what they love about shells. And I do think for this project, I was thinking a lot about shells, but then I was, did some tide pooling, and then also just looking at a lot of local observations on iNaturalist to really be thinking about the organisms that these belong to, because that's something that I often get stuck in our collections where well, not stuck, I'm happy to be here. And I'm also talking to you from our collections right now. But a lot of our collections are primarily dry malacology specimens or shell collections. And so it's always like startlingly exciting to see what these beings look like out in the world. And also, so that kind of moves on to like sort of our first topic. We wanted to kind of ground the history of our malacology collections and our discussion in the forerunners of natural history museums, which were really these European curiosity cabinets, which focused heavily on, the wonder of the natural world, and people were exploring all sorts of different ways, starting around in the 1600s, of gathering up these different objects and organizing them in ways that oftentimes was aesthetically pleasing, or using objects from the natural world to mimic human life. So you would see scenes of like shells would be used to be instruments for like a band made out of like skeleton pieces and all these sorts of things. And then you also would see people who were starting to advertise like, their knowledge as people who had specimens from all over the world, or their wealth because they could afford things from that distances. And so even and these are two curiosity cabinet sort of wonder rooms from the one on the left is from 1672, and the one on the right is from 1706 across Europe. And people were collecting shells and using shells in these sorts of systems of learning and knowing from sort of the earliest days. You even have someone who did like a survey of the different shell rooms across Europe in I think the 1770s, who goes to talk about how a lot of people are organizing these shells, and he starts to notice as he's doing this big survey, as people are starting to write more about this, that the more discerning collector is starting to arrange his shells according to species and families, ignoring the questions of size or symmetry, and then this way mixing the handsome shells with the ordinary ones, whereas the ordinary collector has little interest in science, and the whole arrangement of his cabinet was governed by aesthetic considerations. So these things are starting in like the 1600s. By like the 1700s, you're finding people are leaning more towards thinking about valuing a scientific perspective on them. And it's most commonly thought that this sort of curiosity cabinet phenomenon went to its apex in Victorian era during the mid to late 1800s, which takes us back to sort of our own story as we hop across the pond. And if we look at the next slide, we have our picture of Laura Heacox exploring the coast of Santa Cruz. And so Laura was really well known for her personal collection, so much smaller scale than these giant rooms, but nonetheless widely known and very impressive. Many of us know this story, but whereas lighthouse keepers were required to give tours to the public of the facility, Laura had more than that. She had a whole museum that was just, you know, the result of a life's work of exploring and observing and making notes about and wondering about nature, and shells were a big part of that. So if we go to the next slide, so we see here that we have a shell cabinet sort of towards the left that's actually from the lighthouse room that Laura would let people tour. And that was part of the, you know, some of these shells might have been in the original gift that Laura gave to the city in 1904, and our museum opened up in 1905. And that's a history that we connect to a lot, and that sometimes we get reconnected to in surprising ways. So this cabinet to the right, which you will be able to see, which you have been able to see on display in the museum and will again at some point, was a set of specimens that she actually, because she would, you know, trade and interact with people with her specimens. And so she gave this set of specimens to a teacher at the California School for the Deaf who she was friends with, and then that school then gave it back to us in the early 90s, which is pretty cool. And so Laura also, you know, an important thing about her is that she, or a thing she was widely known for was for being a student of conchology, or a studier of shells, and she corresponded with scientists of the day and had a couple of different specimens named after her. So that brings us to sort of the other thing we want to talk about before we dig into like the collections as a whole, these collections that Laura sort of grounded or that provided the foundation for, and that's the terminology. And oftentimes when we tell the Laura story, we mention that quote about how she was quite a student of conchology, because it's pretty cool to, you know, have evidence of a woman at the time being so involved in a scientific discussion that she would get a specimen named after her. But so conchology is the study of seashells. I'm bouncing around on the slide a little bit, and it's now considered mostly antiquated and pretty much incorporated into the study of malacology, which is the modern study of the entire mollusk organism. So we've got this definition up here, you know, mollusk is a soft-bodied invertebrate animal within the phylum Mollusca. They're a clade of organisms that have soft bodies, which typically have a head and foot region. And then, you know, there's a couple different, there's no single feature beyond that all mollusks have, but there's a couple features that, you know, are distinguishing of mollusks from other animals. And that is the, so the foot region, which is specialized, it's a specialized organ muscle that is in different forms in the different classes, and it can be used for moving around, or in some cases for like digging or grasping things. Then they have the mantle, which is like the soft fleshy bits that covers the body and closes the internal organs, and then it secretes the shell. If there is a shell, not all of them do. And then a lot of mollusks also have a radula, which is a rough scraping like object in its mouth parts that it uses to feed. And so you can see that on the left here of the screen, this is a set of diagrams that actually come from Hulda Hoover Mclean's book about the tide drift shells. So we'll see more of these illustrations later on. And so if we move to the next slide, now we're gonna sort of look more specifically at, or more broadly actually, at the breadth of malacology specimens in our collection. And so we're looking at, right now, there's sort of this when we're talking about mollusks, we're talking about like the second most, it's an incredibly diverse class and has the most number of described species after only arthropods in all of the animals. And so there's going to be a lot of different diversity and a lot of things we could show. And so I kind of picked a couple of areas to look at along like a couple of different categories that present concerns from a collections perspective. So one of them is size. And so these are both bivalves, which is one of the main classes of mollusks, and they have a hinged double shell, and they are the mollusks that don't have radulas, the specialized features that you don't see outside of mollusks. And we have this one giant shell, the Tridacnagigas, which I might be pronouncing wrong, that is a giant clam. These are some of the largest living mollusks, and this is actually from the Humphrey Pilkington collection. It's around the corner in the collections room in a place that has been described in various documents as Clam Alley. So we have, really large specimens like that, and then we have incredibly small specimens like this, this Phyllobrya setosa, which was actually collected by our guest who's going to show up later this evening. And you can see that, you can hardly see that this tiny little half of shell is smaller than the head of a pin. And that's something that, we can't actually have out in the open or moving around. We have to have it carefully organized in different small containers and these jars and vessels to keep track of it. If we want to move to the next slide, another thing that we might be thinking of when we're looking at like the breadth and scope of our collections is the kind of data that we have for them. So if you're looking at these ones, to the right, we have some purple olive shells that were collected here in Santa Cruz, and to the left, we have some various specimens that were collected in Southern California. And one thing that we look at when we're thinking about, the different shell specimens that we have and how we want to, how we connect them to our mission, how we make them relevant to museum programs, and then how we prioritize the enormous scope of the task of digitizing them is what kind of data we have. So for any specimens that we have actual location data, kind of like you saw on the previous slide, and also for some of these, those are going to be really important for us to digitize and connect to the broader scientific community sooner than something where maybe we just have identifying information. Another point that I wanted to make about these specimens is they were both collected by a woman named Fern Wilson. And if you've ever been into the museum and played with the little like shell matching organization game that we have, that is some specimens that, were originally gifted to us from her. And one thing that is really important to recognize when you're talking about malacology collections is the incredible breadth of knowledge, like out of a lot of different fields within natural history, within science. Malacology owes a lot to amateur collectors. A recent survey of American malacology collections found that upwards of 80%, even in the most venerable museums, upwards of 80% of their collections were donations from amateur collectors, which is a pretty exciting history. And these are also gastropods, so they have a single shell, except for the oyster that's in the lower right-hand corner of the left picture. Sorry about that. So these have a single shell with a generally spiral pattern. And so that's the class of gastropods. And so if we want to move to the next slide, there's also, mollusks in the collection that you might not necessarily think of as stereotypical mollusks. And so cephalopods are also a class of mollusks. And we have this tiny freeze-dried octopus. It's a freeze-dried taxidermy specimen from Richard Gurney. And so this is one of the areas in our malacology collection where we don't have a shell, partly because octopuses do not, but also because, we're able, because of our access to someone who is an expert in, freeze drying soft-bodied animals, we were able to get a different kind of specimen. If you look at the right side, we have a chitin, which is from class Polyplacophora. And I apologize if I'm getting any of these names wrong. I mostly just read about them and sometimes also watch videos. But so these are sort of a snail-like mollusk that has 8 segments overlapping its soft body. And this is another, specimen that, people might not think of when they typically think about a snail, for example. One thing that I also think is kind of interesting about comparing these two you know, classes is the octopi are, you know, really, there's especially more and more lately, we're learning just about how brilliant they are. It's kind of an interesting point of comparison for people to think about, like, what an octopus, you know, is aware of and can do, whereas chitons historically have been seen as pretty primitive. They have a pretty primitive nervous system, and there was this really adorable article that came out last year. Someone did a study about how they spent, you know, their whole study looking at when chitons decide to roll into a ball, and how they're capable of the kind of advanced decision-making process that people thought that they were not capable of, which I thought was pretty cute. So that's just sort of a general scope of the different sort of more specimen aspects of our collection, but not all of the shells in our collections are specimens. So we also have collections that are Native American artifacts. And here I wanted to tag back in Marissa, because of her work in our education department and public programs, has become an expert in sharing the museum's perspective on how we interpret the Native American objects in our collection. So if Marissa wants to.
Yeah, hi. So these objects that we're looking at here are abalone pendants, which is one of the uses of shells that has been prevalent here along the Central Coast for thousands of years. The indigenous people of this area have used mollusks as a resource for the long period of time that there have been people inhabiting this area, both for food, but also for adornments, for things like these pendants, which would be used as a kind of the centerpiece of a necklace. And so this is something that that has been happening for a long time, but also still happens today. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen for a moment so that I can share with you all this necklace that I purchased off of a tribal elder of the Amamutsun tribal band, Eleanor Castro, who's someone who we've partnered with at the museum. And she has led workshops at the museum, including making necklaces like this. So this is one of her necklaces, and you can see still to this day using abalone pendants as important pieces of that. And I'm going to share screen again so that we can see another use of shells, which we can see here on this pomo basket. So these are shell beads, and that's one of the primary ways that we do see shells. And these particular shells are made out of clam, or beads are made out of clam shells. And one little anecdote that I have for you is that I've been involved with an archaeology project through the Santa Cruz Mission State Historic Park, where they teach us to go through archaeological materials from Santa Clara University, which is a historic mission site. And so every summer they gather people to help aid in going through the mass amount of quantity that they go through. And our work is particularly looking at smaller items that are found in these like fire pit hearths. And the really exciting moment is when you stumble upon a bead. We're going through small things, and it's often we're noting small bone fragments or small stone fragments, but these beads are very special. And these disc beads that we see on this basket are one of the main types of beads that we find. And one thing that is of note when you're looking at these beads in terms of the time in which they were made is you look at the hole that is drilled within the bead. And so the traditional process of making these holes is using a hand drill that has a stone point at the end that you use your hands to twist together to drill a hole in on one side, and then you flip it over and drill another. And the effect that that has is that on the face of the disc, you have a wider opening and it gets smaller as you reach the center of that hole. Once the Spanish colonized California and the mission system arose, they introduced other tools. And so the indigenous people would still make these beads, but also started using different tools, such as drills that had a metal point. And so when you see a bead that has a straight through hole that doesn't have that variation in size, then you know that it's that it is something that was created after Spanish colonization began. So that's an interesting thing about that. And then also you can see on this Eleanor Castro necklace, she also is using clam beads, much like we see in that image. Also, we see other types of beads, which are found on baskets like this abalone basket that was purchased from Mission Santa Cruz in the 1800s. And these beads are not made out of shells. They are made out of glass. And we're showing this to you because this is a new form of bead making, or of adornment that we see once Spanish colonization occurs. The Spanish start bringing in glass beads, and the indigenous people start to use them in their wares. And I will show you again on this necklace. You're also seeing glass beads, so the red ones here. And so Eleanor uses a mixture of shell beads, like an abalone pendant, like these clam shells, like these shells, which I'm sorry, I forget the name of these, but maybe someone watching knows what they're called and wants to put it in the chat, as well as glass beads and pine nuts. So some really special things that we're seeing on these baskets. And Kathleen might have some additional points to share about some of these objects. What more do we know about them, Kathleen?
Yeah, so I think that for most of us, you know, a lot of members also know this because this basket is a particularly special basket because of the cultural interruption and colonization and some things that Marissa talked about, as well as traditional, you know, some traditions of burning people's possessions after they pass away. There are very few abalone baskets left in the world, and most of them are far away and in European museums. And so it's a pretty incredible thing that we are able to steward this basket here so close to where it was created, this particular abalone basket. So that's kind of the highlight about this particular object. But other than that, I thought you did a great job, Marissa. And then if you want to go to the next slide, so this is, you know, this is a button manufacturing interpretive set of artifacts that have also been in the museum's collection since 1939. And so just another look at, you know, what if we are thinking about non-specimen examples of, you know, shells in our collection, what does that look like? And this also, you know, can be used to look at a different way of how humans connect to nature through use, similar to the way the baskets different, but, you know, in a similar vein to the way, you know, people are connecting to nature by using it. And so if we want to look at one last, you know, kind of area we wanted to think about in terms of like what our malacology, like what the scope of those might be said to contain, we look at something like this, which is, so this is one of the catalog books from that cabinet that's on display upstairs that was from Laura, and this is a book with notes about freshwater shells. And so these are shells she collected, and a lot of times her notes basically list, you know, the specimen name, the common name, who the person was who gave it to her, helped her get it if someone was available, and then goes on to the next one. And so this object is at once, you know, a really important part of the data for some of our shells, but at the same time, it's also an important historical object to us, especially. And so, you know, we kind of wanted to move from there to be thinking about a different book that's also about shells and also a part of our museum's history, but also a big part of the natural history, you know, the cultural and natural history of this community. And so that's Hulda Hoover Mclean's Hydra Shells of the Monterey Bay region, which was originally published as the Hydra Shelves of the Waddell Beaches. Hulda spent a lifetime exploring shells in many other parts of the natural world, which we'll talk about a little bit more. And at a certain point in the 70s, started to think about, you know, in one sense, you know, she had all this knowledge and she had to pursue a lot of that knowledge herself because there were not that many books available. And in her preface to this book, she mentions how she couldn't find any other books available for guiding her engagement with shells on the local beaches. And so she decided and was partly goaded into publishing a book herself by the fact that she was friends with a local reporter, Margaret Koch, who I guess used to go to her when she was asking for features and would often introduce Hulda as this person who was writing a book about local shells. And Hulda would be like, hey, I'm not a scientist. I'm not writing, you know, I love these things and I pay attention to them. But I'm not writing a book. And then at a certain point, a scientist that Hulda corresponded with and met and got references from finally was like, why don't you just write a book about your shell collection? So that I think is a pretty cute story and kind of relates to this sort of like very dynamic, interactive life that Hulda led that started And if we want to go to the next slide, this is her as a child on a butterfly expedition in 1916. And so let me just make sure that I have the. So Hulda was born in 1906 here in California, and then spent part of her early childhood in England, and then came back to grow up in the beautiful area of what is now Rancho del Oso. Her father, Theodore Hoover, bought that property in 1912. He had been a professor and worked at Stanford, and their entire family grew to have many residences and vacation homes on that property, where Hulda spent her life. Oh, and then here's the first house that they built. So this would have been the house that she would have been staying in at that time she was at the butterfly expedition. And so she has in her biography, which I'm drawing heavily from and talking about her life, which will have the cover, will come at the end. I highly recommend it. She just has whole chapters when talking about her childhood where she's like, and here's another thing about the snakes, where she just describes, like different types of animals and interacting with them in detail and noticing them and being just transfixed by their beauty. And at one point mentions how it was a struggle for her as a child to realize that not everyone had like birds who they like knew about, who they were friends with, which is just, so this incredible like joy about the natural world and about, it seems like most anything that she was going to set her mind to. So if we want to go forward to the next slide, so that was, sort of where she spent her childhood. But also a huge portion of her life. So she grew up, she studied at first art and then political science at Stanford. And she, lived in Southern California for a time and then later came back up to settle with her father. You can see in this picture on the left, this is her as a tiny child. She's the one further to the right, collecting shells in England. With her family, and then on the right, she's collecting shells in the Santa Cruz beaches in the 1960s. And so this was sort of a lifetime passion for her. She, of all the things that she liked to do, shells seemed to be a thing that she regularly returned to, partly because she was interested and then partly because she was able to have these physical collections that she would then bring home and organize and engage with regularly throughout the years. And in the one on the right, she's actually probably in the act of collecting shells to replace her childhood collection, which burned down when the family home burned down, when there was a fire on Rancho del Oso in the 60s, I believe. So shell collecting is a big thing for her, but she doesn't just collect nature and observe nature, she also depicted nature. And so these are watercolor paintings. These are also pictures from her biography, and I'm sorry that they're not in color. But these, and this is, one is the alders at Waddell Creek, and then one of them is to the right, that's Waddell Beach. And so she had sort of a lifelong interest in art. She painted from the time she was a child. It wasn't something she did, professionally necessarily, but as she got more into painting the landscapes that she grew up loving and that she then, lived around for most of her life, she also got into illustrating insects. She took some classes at Cabrillo College in botanical illustration and started working on a project illustrating insects as part of a local collecting project, and made materials that actually got incorporated into school curriculum, which was pretty cool. So her life was pretty cool in general. She, had a full scope from, a childhood so almost 100 years is the title of her biography. And so she witnessed, the Spanish flu, and this is her on the right wearing a mask during that epidemic. She, was primarily interested in, as a profession, she, did a bunch of different things. Like if a local school teacher broke her leg, she would teach classes. She farmed the Rancho del Oso when her mother died, and she moved back there to take care of her father. But she was also very interested in the notions of what is a good government and how do people be civically engaged and keep their governments accountable. And so if you go to the next slide, this is an incredible picture of the second time she ran for Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors. And the first time she won, she ended up serving 2 terms. And it was at a time where she got a lot of support even at the first round, but she was still having people come up to her and telling her things like, I would sooner vote for a dog to be county supervisor than for a woman. but that didn't faze her, and she ended up serving 2 terms, and it was largely because it seemed like for Hulda, everything that she encountered in life, if she wanted to be able to engage with it, she wanted to be able to do it. She was often called a high-spirited child, and that, like, you know, she got eloped without her parents' permission. She would, you know, wander around at night on the beaches, and really just kind of followed, you know, what she thought was the thing to do. And when she was thinking about becoming a Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisor, the way she described it is, you know, I kept wanting to do these things, and then I would run into the, you know, I would try to get things done, and then I would bump up against the board of the Santa Cruz County Board of Supervisors. And so I just decided to become one, which is a really incredible attitude. So this is her in her later years. So the timeline was really, so she grew up at Rancho del Oso. She moved away, she moved to Southern California. Her mother died in the 40s, and she moved back to help take care of her father. After some time, he passed away, and she and her husband were living partly in town and partly at the ranch. She had been talking to members of her family about what it would look like. You know, she was really concerned about the conservation of the area, as her father had been, and she was interested in trying to arrange a deal where she could give this land or sell the land to the state to make a park. And so that finally happened in the late 70s. She was able to negotiate with her family an agreement where they still had the right of way and some access to that land. But the park system got the Rancho del Oso area, and they, and Waddell Beach, which allowed the Skyline to Sea Trail to be possible. And then she and her husband's personal home later became the actual Rancho del Oso Nature Center, which we can see in the next screen. And then, oh wait, one more. There we go. So the Nature History Center, which she describes at length in her biography, Almost 100 Years, about like how she, the importance to her of making sure that people were able to connect with this land, and like the logistics of how they were able to make it possible, and her gratitude towards folks at the Sempervirens Fund, for example, who helped make that possible. So this is just sort of a brief touching on the life of an incredible woman, and looking at it in ways through the lens of how she was able to focus on so many projects at once. And one of those projects, which she was able to come back to with the help of this institution, was her book, which Frank will talk about this a little bit more because he was involved, but the museum helped publish an updated version of Hydra Shells of the Waddell Beaches to Hydra Shells of the Monterey Bay region in the early 90s. And Hulda was, you know, able to approve those updates, which involved, you know, adding some specimens and a couple other things, which, you know, Frank will talk about. But most of the book has all these incredible illustrations, primarily drawn by Hulda, which is part of those, you know, biological illustration skills that she was getting so interested in, especially like, you know, midlife. And then it had like a description of, you know, a given specimen. And also I should say that the book is organized into a series of, it has a whole extensive list of advice for local collectors, amateur collectors. It really advocates for engaging with scientists, and trying to, you know, really do the footwork to get a sense. You know, she didn't just expect to hand people this guide and have them have like a sort of flat basic relationship with it. She wanted it to be something that would be a starting point for people to go and look for shells themselves, and then to read up on things for themselves and to connect to research. So that comes through a lot. And so a lot of the descriptions look like that. And then we have some highlights like we featured on the blog. I'm gonna drink a little bit of water. And I apologize for the folks at home. I usually, I'm better at pacing myself when I have a live human audience that I can see. But I'm also happy to answer any questions and expand upon any of this when we have a Q&A session at the end. But so these are different highlights from her collections, which I thought just for me when I was like, or from her book, were sort of indicative of like, you know, the stylistic voice that she had, which is just super engaging. And so she brings up abalone shells, and she talks about, you know, the status of their conservation, how she doesn't see them as much anymore, how people are working on, you know, abalone fisheries. And she also describes them as the beauty queens of our local shells. They have an almost flamboyant beauty with their graceful shape and brilliantly opalescent interior. And so she sometimes is really dry, but has a lot of flair also. Another thing that I really liked about her sort of attitude is that these teeny tiny olivella shells are, you know, from like a sort of subset throughout the book of where she talks about these smaller shells. And some shells, she's like, these are cool, but they're so small. If you don't have a microscope, don't even worry about it. I couldn't even try. Just very practical lady, but she also just talks about how, like, for her, this shelling was a super dynamic, lifelong sort of vocational experience, right? Like, you didn't have to know what something was immediately. And so for these smaller shells, she would say, my advice is to collect a lot of them, and then some rainy day, settle down with good light and a magnifying glass and separate them into little piles of lookalikes. You may find we have more species than I've had time, patience, eyesight, or knowledge to distinguish. Which is sort of this iterative engagement with those specimens. And then also, again, acknowledging that she's like a starting point. She wants to give people a guide where she didn't have one, but she doesn't expect to be the whole story. The giant rock scallop, I wanted to include this in here because I thought her drawings to me were really striking, and I've always appreciated how sometimes through like, you know, drawings and illustration, you can highlight things that help people identify specimens. But also she points out in her book how she would have liked, you know, how these will not, you know, be better than photographs. And one way where I think we can see that is the distinguishing purple mark that's on the hinge of the giant rock scallop, which she wasn't able to convey in her book, but which is an important part for identifying the specimen. I also liked how, you know, in later pages, just in thinking about the colors of the specimens, she has a point where she talks about how members of a particular clam family are mostly white. And I don't suppose one has to be an absolute nut about shells to be enthusiastic about white clams, but it probably helps. Which I think throughout her book, you get this sort of like self-deprecating humor about, like, you know, recognizing that she's really passionate about this, and a lot of people are, but at the same time, recognizing that it takes a certain kind of person to spend their entire life collecting this many shells. And then this is just a moon snail shell with barnacles growing on it that I thought was adorable, and also is my opportunity to talk about how there's much more to this collection than we've even depicted here today. This is just sort of touching base. And, you know, our collection, as I mentioned earlier, has benefited from, in so many ways, from, you know, a variety of local collectors, one of whom is Frank Perry, who's about to come on and talk about the work that his expertise in malacology supported him to do in updating this book. Hello, Frank.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us today. And so Frank and I have talked a little bit before when we were talking about the blog, and in many other ways. Frank is an incredibly helpful gentleman, a big friend of the museum. But we have a couple questions for you today. And one of them is if you could start by describing the work that you did to edit this book.
Yes, well, as you mentioned earlier, Hulda Mclean did a book, Tide Drift Shells of the Waddell Beaches, which she published herself. And a number of years later, the Waddell Creek Association decided they wanted to reprint it, but the staff with the association, volunteers, none of them had experience producing a book. So they approached the Museum of Natural History to see about partnering with the museum and producing the book. And that's when I got involved, because just as Hulda had been collecting shells up in the Waddell Creek area, I had spent many years collecting shells in the Santa Cruz Capitola area. And some of the species are different from what's on the North Coast. So I offered to help expand the book to the Monterey Bay region, therefore making it appeal to a bigger audience. So I added descriptions of the additional shells and tried to write them in a way that was like Hulda had written. And then also we got a local high school student, a senior at Santa Cruz High at that time, Amy Matthews, to make drawings of the additional shells. I gave her the shells to draw from, so she drew them from life. She later went on to major in art in college. And her grandparents, Pat and Kirk Smith, were very involved with both the Waddell Creek Association and the museum. So that's how Amy came to get involved with the project.
Yeah, and I remember you mentioning that, and that's part of why I thought it was really interesting that, because Amy went on to study art at Stanford and Hulda began her career at Stanford also studying art, which I thought was kind of neat. And so speaking of Hulda, so in previous conversations, you've talked about how if there was a Santa Cruz Naturalist Hall of Fame, Hulda would be in it. And this sort of the, important naturalist in Santa Cruz history is something I've heard you talk about before. And I kind of want to know, in your words, what makes someone a supernaturalist, and how does Hulda fulfill those qualities?
Well, I would certainly put her on the list of supernaturalists among the local naturalists through Santa Cruz history. Laura Hecox would also be on that list, and C.L. Anderson, who was a contemporary of hers, but a little bit older, and Harry and Mary Turver, who were involved with the museum in the 30s and 40s. And most recently, Randy Morgan, who unfortunately died just a few years ago, but he was another incredible naturalist. To be a good naturalist, I think it's important to have a broad general knowledge of natural history. But in most cases, naturalists have their specialty. You mentioned how Hulda Mclean spent a lot of time studying both shells and insects. Anderson was an expert on marine algae. Randy Morgan, I think was topped though, because he knew just about every bird in Santa Cruz County, every native plant in Santa Cruz County, and every insect in Santa Cruz County. And because he studied these things in such great detail, he discovered new things things that people hadn't noticed before. He discovered the abalone tiger beetle and some new species of plants as well. So that's, in general, I think to be a good naturalist requires a lot of patience and willing to take the time to make really detailed observations. And most importantly, a real deep curiosity and love of nature. And if you have that deep love of the subject, then having the patience and taking the time to make the observations, that's easy, because that's not work, that's fun.
Yeah. And it's a kind of fun that you have done for, I think, all of your life. And I was wondering if you could talk about your relationship to shell collecting, and how that influenced how you relate to the world around you.
Well, sometime when I was a little kid, I started collecting shells. I would go on vacation trips with my parents to places where there were beaches. And growing up, from the time I was a little kid, I just loved collecting stuff, whether it be pine cones or shells. I had an insect collection for a while, and I at one point painted pictures of all the different species of birds that I saw on the property where I lived. And so I loved collecting stuff, rocks and fossils too, of course. And so I would my mother would take me to the library and get books on how to identify the shells. And it was kind of tough at first when I was a real little kid, but as I got older, say high school age, then I got better at identifying them and better at understanding the little bit more technical books, something beyond the Golden Nature Guide book of shells. So that's what I did when I was a kid. And it really, I think shell collecting is a wonderful activity for children, because you learn about nature, so many important different facets of nature. I learned about how animals are classified, about the different phyla and classes and orders and families and so forth. And I learned about biodiversity, as we've seen from some of your slides, incredible diversity among the mollusks. And also I learned about, well, one of my favorite topics is functional morphology, which is why are shells shaped the way they are? You know, some clams are adapted for burrowing quickly into sand. Others, like mussels, are adapted to clinging on real tight to rocks so that they don't get swept away by waves in the intertidal. And still other kinds of clams are adapted to drill into the rocks. So it's interesting to see all those different shapes of shells and what they tell us about how the animal lives.
Which I think goes well into like our next question, because you are a person who has studied far more than just shells, and I was wondering how that kind of knowledge has influenced or has related to other fields of study that you have undertaken.
Well, on a couple of occasions, I helped archaeologists identify shells from archaeological sites. One from a Native American site, and in another case from a historic site. Shells, of course, being hard and holding up well when buried, get preserved, some cases for thousands of years, and they can tell us what the people were eating, you know, decades ago or even hundreds of years ago. At an archaeological site in Santa Cruz, one of the things I found was a whale barnacle. And I don't think they were eating the barnacle, but I think that tells us that they were bringing home chunks of whale to eat. And so that I thought that was quite fascinating. And then also when I got into studying the fossil mollusks, being familiar with the modern mollusks was very helpful, because I was running into a lot of the same families and genera.
Yeah, which is super, super interesting we could have expanded into sort of our fossil collection, but I decided that at some point we needed to tie a ribbon on a subset because there's too many things to talk about at once. And so that sort of brings us to the end of our questions for now, with the final question of what advice do you have for amateur collectors?
Well, my advice would be to have fun, you know, enjoy seeing what you can find. And it's like any kind of collecting, there's that excitement of never knowing what you're going to find. Maybe you'll find some species that you have never found before, or maybe a better specimen than you've found in the past. And in most cases, most areas around here, it's perfectly okay to pick up empty shells on the beach. You don't want to collect the living animals, of course, they're protected. There are a few areas like marine reserves where they don't allow collecting of any kind. And I think Pacific Grove is very strict. I don't think they allow any type of collecting. But most areas like Capitola Beach and some of the other areas, it's fine to collect shells, and it's a great activity for children in particular.
Thank you so much, Frank.
Yeah, we did have some interest in this idea of collecting ethics come up in the chat. It's a common concern and question that people have. And so maybe Kathleen, do you want to speak a little bit about the museum's collection policies and our recommendations that we share out to the public in regards to collecting items, maybe beyond even shells?
Yeah, so, and this also, you know, one thing that I thought was cool looking at like Hulda's recommendations in the beginning of the book is that she sort of has a similar thing to like what we've talked about and shared out, which is that you generally want to know what you're collecting. You want to familiarize yourself with the regulations for the air, like the physical area you are at. Like, is it a marine reserve? Like, is it like a city beach? Is it a state park? And each of those is going to have different regulations about where or what you can collect and take with you. So you want to know what you're taking, and you want to know where like you are and what those rules are. And then you also want to think about like the impact that you're having by collecting. And so if, you know, like we've talked about in previous instances, like if you are collecting to make an art project and you're getting within the legal amount of seaweed from a place where you can take it, like why not take the invasive species if that's something that, you know, you can work equally well for your purposes, things like that. So that's sort of a general.
Yeah, and I know that we've talked about with shells in particular that it's the waste of this organism. It's not exactly the same as when we've talked about algae, of being concerned about foraging in a manner that allows the organism to continue to thrive. And so there's also these things that you need to balance when you're making your decisions, and also thinking about what's the reason for your interest in that. And I think so much of what we're talking about of being able to appreciate shells and to connect with nature can be done by looking at them where they are. And I personally really love making my own little collections in a space and then leaving it behind. I feel like I get something out of that, but I also definitely appreciate the ability to spend more time with an object too. So it's something, like you said, we've all got to educate ourselves and understand the costs and the benefits of those types of actions. And if, you know, those of you joining us out there, if you have any further questions, please do jot them down really quickly for us. I wanted to ask Kathleen and Frank both, because you both have expertise in this, touching on what you briefly mentioned about our malacology collections and our paleontology collections, and just this technical distinction between that, because so much of our paleontology collections are shells, are they not?
Yeah.
Correct.
Frank should talk about this part.
And also, like, you know, talking about Laura, right, and her shell collections was, Frank, maybe you know about this, the majority of her collections that did involve shells, were they mostly fossil shells, or were they mostly not fossil shells?
I think they were mostly not fossils, but she also collected fossil shells, and there was even a species of fossil shell that a paleontologist named in her honor.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we're going to be sending out in like the resources as like a follow-up is this really interesting article for people who are interested in like the collections and like collections data kind of nerd aspect of this sort of stuff, called Mobilizing Mollusks. And it's about like an overview of like mollusk collections in the US and covers parts of Canada, and like how they're getting digitized, how they're being accessed by science. That article was looking also at how people organize the information about mollusks. And it seems that most American museums also do organize fossils within their paleontology collections. We're pretty small, so some of the reasons why people might want to do that, you know, might not necessarily hold for us, but also it's a lot about like, you know, what people are studying and the kinds of inquiries you're getting about particular specimens.
And so we briefly just touched on Laura, who we always have to talk about over and over again. And we're going to be talking about her a lot next month too, because I don't know if you all out there are aware of this, but we are reaching an important milestone in August. We're going to have our 115th anniversary of opening to the public. Laura deeded her collections in April of 1904, but the museum first opened its doors in August of 1905. And so we are planning some exciting things to celebrate that milestone. And also Kathleen's going to be writing her next article kind of in honor of that moment. And our next member event like this is also going to be kind of tied to that. So Kathleen, do you want to give us a sneak peek of what we're going to be talking about next month?
Yeah, so we're going to be thinking about like the physical spaces of the museum. And so that ties us to like, we have this history of moving about in different parts of the community, and thinking about how we're relating to those and interpreting those, and also thinking about the changes that the way that those moves impacted the collections. and the ways our physical space can better impact the collections into the future. So we might get a little bit more into like preservation and conservation concerns in this one, but we also might look at some interesting like miniature models of like when the museum was re-envisioning a future for itself in different places within the county. So it's going to be pretty fun.
So thrilled. And if you are interested, as I'm sure you are, because you're joining us here today to talk about this stuff, Frank actually gave a lecture in honor of our 110th anniversary, I believe, about Laura's legacy and her life. And so you can find that on our website as well if you want to dive into that. But we hope you'll join us next month. And I'm going to just briefly share again this list of resources that Kathleen has put together for us. So I'm going to be sending out an email to all of you that has these resources for you to dive into. And some of them are very technical and some of them are very more surface level fun. So a little bit for everyone, including the blog post that Kathleen wrote. So if you haven't read it yet, there's some additional information within that. If you found yourself entirely endeared to Hulda and you want to learn more, take a look at those when we send out the follow-up email. And also, we will be sending out a link to a survey, and we really hope that you'll take just a few minutes to fill out that survey so that we can make sure that we are providing the resources that you're most interested in and that we're doing you proud. So please take a moment to look for that email. I'll send it out tonight. And then also this whole program will be, we've been recording it and we're going to put it on the website by the end of the day tomorrow, so you can find it then. So, so thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Frank, so much for this. And thank you, everyone joining us. Thank you for being a member of the museum. And we hope to see you back inside the museum soon. But for now, we're really grateful to be able to spending time with you in this way. So see you all again soon. Have a good night.